Jake Thompson sat in the back of Mrs. Parker's English class, a mischievous grin plastered on his face. He was the kind of student who thrived on chaos, his energy radiating like a beacon of disruption. As Mrs. Parker attempted to explain Shakespeare's complex themes, he couldn't resist the urge to blurt out, "Isn't this just a fancy way of saying love stinks?" The classroom erupted in laughter, but Mrs. Parker simply sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose with a weary, yet familiar expression. "Jake, please," she said, her voice laced with both exasperation and a hint of fondness. "Can you at least try to focus for a moment?" He shrugged, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "But Mrs. Parker, it's so much more fun to make you mad." While the other students chuckled, Mrs. Parker couldn't help but see a spark of potential in him. She often thought about how his intelligence was masked by his antics. "You know, Jake, one day you might just surprise everyone with what you can do if you apply yourself," she said, hoping to reach the part of him that was buried beneath layers of bravado. But that day, her words fell on deaf ears. In an impulsive act, Jake launched a paper airplane across the room, aiming for the unsuspecting head of the student in front of him. The plane soared gracefully before crashing into a stack of textbooks, prompting a chorus of laughter once again. However, the laughter faded when Mrs. Parker caught his eye, her disappointment palpable. "Enough, Jake. This isn't a playground. It's a classroom. I expect better from you." Feeling misunderstood and frustrated, Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get it, Mrs. Parker. You think I'm just a joke. I'll show you one day." With that, he stormed out of the classroom, slamming the door behind him, leaving Mrs. Parker staring after him, concern etched on her face. As graduation approached, Jake often found himself reflecting on those turbulent years. The halls of high school buzzed with excitement, yet he felt an unsettling emptiness. He had spent so long trying to prove himself, but now, as he donned his cap and gown, he realized he was still searching for his identity. Standing in the gymnasium, surrounded by his classmates, he caught sight of Mrs. Parker in the crowd, clapping proudly. For a moment, their eyes locked, and he felt a flicker of something deep within, a longing for her acknowledgement, her belief in him that he had dismissed so easily. As the ceremony concluded, Jake stepped outside, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. He was free from high school, yet he knew he hadn't yet escaped from the shadow of his own choices. "What now?" he whispered to himself, uncertainty swirling in his mind as he took a deep breath, ready to embark on a journey of self-discovery. Jake Thompson sat in his sleek, modern office, the city skyline stretching out behind him like a canvas of opportunity. Yet, despite his success as an entrepreneur, his mind drifted back to the chaotic halls of Crestwood High. The memories of Mrs. Parker's English class flooded his thoughts, a mix of annoyance and nostalgia. He could still hear her voice, firm yet encouraging, reminding him that he was capable of greatness. "Jake, can you please focus?" Mrs. Parker had often exclaimed, trying to keep the class on track as he launched into yet another off-topic story. But now, those moments felt like cherished fragments of a past that shaped him. With a flicker of determination, Jake pulled up an article he had saved about Mrs. Parker's retirement. Her warm smile in the photo struck a chord deep within him, igniting a desire to reconnect. He knew he needed to apologize for his teenage antics, to tell her just how much her belief in him had mattered. Grabbing his phone, he dialed her number, his heart racing as the line rang. "Hello." The familiar voice sent a rush of emotions through him. "Mrs. Parker, it's Jake Thompson," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "I hope you remember me." "Of course, Jake. How could I forget my most lively student?" she replied, her tone laced with warmth and a hint of laughter. "I read about your retirement, and I just wanted to call and apologize," she interjected lightly. He chuckled nervously. "Yes, and to tell you how much you influenced my life. I've been thinking about visiting you." "Oh, that would be lovely," Mrs. Parker exclaimed. "I have so many stories to share about my years teaching." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I can't wait. I'll see you soon." After hanging up, he took a deep breath, a mix of excitement and anxiety coursing through him. The thought of seeing Mrs. Parker after all these years filled him with a sense of purpose. He remembered all the times he had pushed her buttons, yet here he was, about to reconnect with the one person who had seen a spark of potential in him. As he prepared for the visit, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be more than just an apology. It was a chance for redemption, a moment to honor the impact she had on his life, and perhaps to finally express the gratitude he had carried for so long. Jake stepped out of his car, taking in the familiar sight of Mrs. Parker's quaint home. The garden, once filled with a vibrant chaos of wildflowers, now appeared more subdued, yet it retained a charm that felt like a warm embrace. He hesitated for a moment, memories flooding back, his playful interruptions, her exasperated sighs, and the flicker of disappointment in her eyes during their last confrontation. With a deep breath, he approached the door and knocked. Mrs. Parker answered almost immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. "Jake, is that really you?" she exclaimed, a mixture of disbelief and joy lighting up her face. "Hi, Mrs. Parker," Jake replied, a nervous smile creeping across his lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Oh, not at all. Come in, come in." She stepped aside, ushering him into the cozy living room. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of her teaching days, and the scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. As they settled onto the sofa, the initial awkwardness hung between them like a thin veil. Mrs. Parker studied Jake, noticing the changes that 30 years had etched into his features. His once boyish face now held the weight of experiences, yet his eyes sparkled with the same mischief she remembered. "It's been so long," she said, breaking the silence. "What brings you back to this old place?" "I wanted to see you, to talk," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot about high school, about us." Mrs. Parker leaned forward, her expression softening. "You were always a challenge, Jake. But I worried about you. You had so much potential." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't see it then," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "I was so focused on being the class clown that I lost sight of what mattered. But you always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." "Believe me, it wasn't easy," she chuckled lightly. "But there was something about you that made me hold on to that hope. I just knew you were destined for something great." Jake felt a swell of emotion as he prepared to share his journey since graduation, eager to reveal how her support had shaped him. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, Mrs. Parker's phone rang, interrupting the moment. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, standing up quickly. "It's my daughter. She sounds distressed." Jake nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. As she stepped away, he couldn't help but reflect on how much he wanted to express his gratitude, to finally reveal the culmination of his efforts and the tribute he had crafted in her honor. He sat there, a whirlwind of thoughts churning in his mind, waiting anxiously for her return. As Mrs. Parker spoke softly into the phone, Jake's mind drifted back to his high school days. He could picture himself sitting in her classroom, restless and full of mischief, but also filled with a longing for validation. He remembered the day he had been on the verge of giving up. It was during a particularly grueling math class, where the numbers danced mockingly on the page. He had felt so lost, so inadequate, that he had seriously contemplated walking away from school altogether. But then, he recalled Mrs. Parker's voice echoing in his mind. "You have a gift, Jake. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words had ignited a spark within him, a determination to prove her right. He had pushed through the challenges, slowly transforming his frustrations into fuel for his ambitions. All of this came flooding back to him as he sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life dedicated to teaching. When Mrs. Parker finally hung up the phone, she looked visibly shaken. Jake immediately sensed her distress. "Is everything okay?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her hair back. "It's just my daughter, Emily. She's been struggling with her career choices. I worry about her." Jake, surprising even himself, reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm really sorry to hear that. If there's anything I can do, just let me know. I know how tough it can be to find your path." Mrs. Parker blinked, taken aback by his sincerity. "Thank you, Jake. That means a lot. I've always believed in supporting my students, and it's heartening to see you offering the same kindness." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the years of tension began to dissolve. They shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged through their respective struggles. Jake could see the weight of her worries reflected in her eyes, and he felt a swell of empathy for the woman who had once been so frustrated with him. With a newfound courage, Jake decided it was time to share what he had come to say. "Mrs. Parker, there's something I need to tell you. The reason I wanted to visit today," he paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "I've dedicated my latest business venture to you. It's a tribute to everything you taught me and the belief you had in me back when I was just a kid." Mrs. Parker's expression shifted from concern to surprise, her eyes widening. "You dedicated your business to me?" Jake nodded, the sincerity in his voice palpable. "Your influence was a guiding light for me. I wouldn't be where I am without you. I wanted you to know that." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Mrs. Parker's heart swelled with pride and gratitude, as she searched for words to express the depth of her feelings. She had always hoped that her efforts in the classroom had made a difference, but this revelation from Jake was more than she could have ever imagined. Jake watched as Mrs. Parker's eyes glimmered with a mix of surprise and emotion. "You really dedicated your business to me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I did," Jake replied, feeling the weight of the moment. "Your belief in me was the anchor during my darkest times. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I thought about giving up. But your words always echoed in my mind, reminding me to keep pushing forward." Mrs. Parker smiled, a warm light spreading across her face. "I always knew you had it in you, Jake. You just needed to believe in yourself as much as I did." Jake leaned forward, his heart racing. "After high school, I struggled a lot. I failed at my first business venture, and it felt like the end of the world. But then I thought of you, of all those times you encouraged me. It gave me the strength to try again. And I did. Eventually, I succeeded." "That's incredible," Mrs. Parker said, her voice thick with pride. "I'm so proud of you." Just then, a sudden knock on the door broke the intensity of their conversation. They both turned as the door swung open, revealing Emily, Mrs. Parker's daughter. Her expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity as she took in the scene. "Mom, sorry for barging in, but I really needed to talk," Emily began, her eyes darting between Jake and her mother. "Emily, come in," Mrs. Parker encouraged, waving her over. "We were just catching up." Jake was sharing some of his journey since high school. As Jake and Emily exchanged greetings, a spark of recognition ignited in Emily's eyes. "Wait, you're Jake Thompson? The Jake she always talked about?" she asked, a hint of admiration in her voice. "That's me," Jake chuckled, feeling a wave of nostalgia. "I hope the stories were good." "They were enlightening," Emily admitted, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "I've been struggling with my career choices lately, and hearing about your journey might just give me some ideas." Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What are you working on?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then blurted out, "I've been toying with the idea of starting a creative consultancy, but I don't know where to begin. You know, with my business experience, I could help you figure things out," Jake offered, his excitement growing. He glanced at Mrs. Parker, who was watching the exchange with an encouraging smile. "Seriously?" Emily asked, her eyes brightening. "Absolutely," Jake replied, feeling a sense of purpose. "I think we could create something amazing together." As they continued to talk, a connection formed between them, blooming into a potential collaboration that made Mrs. Parker's heart swell with hope. She could see the pieces falling into place, the past intertwining with the future in a way that promised new beginnings for them all. As Jake, Mrs. Parker, and Emily settled around the kitchen table, the atmosphere hummed with a mix of excitement and nostalgia. Mrs. Parker leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with the same enthusiasm she had shown in the classroom years ago. "You know," she began, her voice steady, "when I think of collaboration, I remember how much we all learn from each other. Your differences can really spark something amazing." Emily, her notebook open and pen poised, nodded eagerly. "I've always wanted to create a program that combines art with real-world applications. Something that shows students how creativity can lead to opportunities." She glanced at Jake, her mind racing with possibilities. What if we designed workshops that involve local artists and entrepreneurs? Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. That's brilliant, Emily. We could host events where students work directly with professionals in the field. They could learn not just about art but about marketing, branding, and even business management. Exactly, Emily exclaimed, her excitement palpable. And we could even include a showcase at the end of each semester to highlight their work. It could be a community event, drawing in families and local businesses. Mrs. Parker beamed at their enthusiasm. This is exactly what I envisioned when I started teaching. Students connecting with a community, seeing the value in what they create. It's not just about art. It's about building relationships and skills that will serve them for a lifetime. As they brainstormed, Jake felt a surge of inspiration. This was more than just a project. It was a chance to give back. Clearing his throat, he shared his biggest surprise. I've been thinking a lot about how to honor my journey and the impact you've both had on my life. I want to dedicate a portion of my business profits to support arts education in schools. Mrs. Parker's eyes widened, and Emily gasped softly. Jake, that's incredible. You really mean it. I do, he affirmed, feeling a warmth spread through him. I want to help future generations have the same opportunities one didn't always recognize. We can create something meaningful together. In that moment, the three of them shared a collective understanding, a bond forged through their past struggles and present aspirations. They embraced their shared vision, realizing that their journeys had led them to this transformative moment. As they discussed further plans, laughter filled the room, and hope blossomed anew, highlighting the undeniable power of mentorship, forgiveness, and new beginnings.